My guest today is Sam Cooper, investigative journalist and publisher of The Bureau. We discuss his investigation into a massive national security breach at Canada's highest level security microbiology lab in Winnipeg, where Chinese scientists allegedly sent samples of viruses like Ebola to the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other sites in China months before a global pandemic was declared. We discuss the links between these scientists and China's People's Liberation Army and the Canadian government's efforts to cover up the breach. Once again, Sam draws vital connections and brings clarity to a story that has many Canadians confused as to how such a brazen assault on our national security could occur under the watchful eye of top-level bureaucrats. Stay tuned. Sam, it's good to see you again, my brother.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, it's almost like we're talking every couple of weeks now. It's been pretty crazy.
Yeah, there's always a big story that, I've been working on for years, and sometimes something happens fast and suddenly you can report things that you've known and that have troubled you for a long time.
Yeah, so speaking of which, the reason you're here today is this Winnipeg biolab story. So would you mind kind of laying out what allegedly occurred for people outside of Canada? And I mean, even people in Canada, because there's so much happening that I think this story kind of has gotten buried under a lot of the culture war issues.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a good way to introduce our international listeners is, look, let's go back to January, February, March 2020. Everyone's trying to figure out what the hell is happening in this world. What is this new uh, coronavirus that's sweeping across, moving faster than anything in recent history, right? This is 100-year type event. People are dying. People don't know how to respond to this. A lot of people are lining up for vaccines. Some people are saying, hey, wait, we don't know. So there was, I just want to, sidetrack and say I was digging into, what was very clearly a Chinese Communist Party cover up of how they were dealing with the pandemic. The timelines, very early on, it made no sense. They were clearly hiding things. And so the rest of the world, just to focus the story, people start to question, is this, of course, there's the Wuhan market theory. And then we start to hear, people, what seems like a tinfoil hat conspiracy that, hey, there's this Wuhan lab that is pretty close to the Wuhan wet market. And could that be involved? And so that was very quickly, as you remember, suppressed, and people were said that's mis or disinformation. You're causing people to have fear or the wrong thoughts. But to jump to the chase, as I knew very early on, because I have access to speak to people in intelligence, I was starting to hear that actually this is quite plausible, that not only are people taking it very seriously, that Wuhan, the lab, could have been involved in the coronavirus pandemic. They were clearly doing, although no one wants to talk about it, they were doing dangerous gain of function research. There were certain words that you couldn't even say at that time, even as a journalist. And yet, me, of course, I'm always going to report carefully and take my time, but I was digging into what's happening in Wuhan. On the one hand, I was hearing from intelligence that, hey, don't throw out this possibility that the Chinese military had an accident in that lab, right? So this is mind-blowing stuff. I can't jump on Twitter and say, hey, I just heard this from a source. And, I've got to get more information, but let's leave that there. 2020, 2021, people are still starting to understand the Winnipeg lab. Suddenly people hear that these two, whatever they are, we thought they were scientists, Dr. Zhanggo Chu and Dr. Kading Cheng, they've got more than one name, we now know. They were kicked out of the Winnipeg lab in the summer of 2019. And so people started to say, hey, what is going on in the Winnipeg lab? And, I'll let you ask all the questions because there's so much going on here. But to set this up, the Liberal Party of Justin Trudeau has for years since that happened, and I know directly, Health Canada has been blocking any inquiry into why were these two Canadian citizens who came from China kicked out of that lab. What's going on with the RCMP investigation? Where's CSIS in this? And, as it comes up in political discussions, the Liberal government is saying basically nothing to see here. No, we can't share the documents because that will, hurt our national security. But other parties are saying it looks like something very bad happened. Let's see the documents. The Liberals are saying, no, that's racist. And so when they say that, as I know, something very bad happened, and that's their go-to to cover it up.
Right.
So let's just jump to 2 weeks ago. 600 pages of redacted CSIS and Health Canada investigation records are finally released. Everyone in the world has reported on this, but probably no one has perhaps the I don't know what I have, but whether it's an obsessive focus on detail. If something is blocked out in a redaction, and yet I can find out what is behind that, and the public should know, I'm going to take my time to do that. So, looking at those redacted documents, I think a good way to start before your many questions is I could discover that Dr. Q, the Winnipeg, star virologist, was working with Dr. Shi Zhengli. That's the bat woman that we know so well that was working on bat coronaviruses and said, hey, nothing to do with the lab leak. She was working with the highest level of Chinese military bioweapon research. We could call them officials. Some of them would be intelligence agents. And so I, was able to piece together the web and the network that Q is working at the highest levels on the bat coronavirus, more specifically and more provably on Ebola gain of function. And all of this is, leading to, I would say, bolstering the theories. I know we want to talk about details here, but it's bolstering the theories that Q and the Winnipeg lab were tasked just so thoroughly and brilliantly by Chinese intelligence to use Canada's scientific capacity to assist China's nefarious and clandestine, dangerous research on Nipah, Ebola, gain of function bat filovirus synthesis. And something I'm saying, this adds to the Western intelligence that has come out with what they can say publicly in recent years, that those that will go on the record and say, on a balance of probabilities, something went wrong in the Wuhan lab that caused the pandemic. And so these documents showing Q's network, etc., just prove that more and more. But probably more important for Canadians maybe is it just shows how deeply our scientific system was significantly controlled from about 2013 by this network, controlled from the highest level of China military intelligence.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Okay, so just to kind of lay things out here. So in Canada, our highest level biolab is located in Winnipeg. This is the lab that we are talking about. Timeline wise, Sam, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but August 2019, we have 2 Chinese nationals that are walked out of the lab. We don't know why. Internal communications, whatever documents were available to us at the time, kind of led us to believe that there were viral samples being sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. October 2019, at the military games in, I believe it's Beijing, members of the military start coming down with a mysterious flu-like illness. Fast forward, December, January, pandemic hits China. March 2020, pandemic hits the rest of the world, especially us here in North America. Now, do we know how long these scientists that were working in this Winnipeg lab were sending viral samples back to China prior to 2019?
Now, what we know is, very focused on what the Canadian government will let us know in a minimized way. So let's walk back. Dr. Chu and her husband are walked out of the Winnipeg lab August 2019 because there's a security breach. But it took a long time for Canadians for the information to dribble out that in March 2019, for just inexplicable reasons besides corruption and espionage, Dr. Q and some other Winnipeg scientists send mice and guinea pig adapted viruses from the Winnipeg lab. They send Ebola, they send Nipah, all kinds of the most dangerous pathogens in the world. and they send them to Wuhan. No one can know why, but why that happened, to track back allegedly why this security investigation into Chu and her husband happens is you could find an open source that Dr. Chu has developed a patent for, I believe it's Marburg or MERS or one of these viruses, and so people at Health Canada, whether they're that bright or not, anyone can find this online, and they're saying, hey, that's a little bit strange, right? So then when you start to track back, you can find an open source that she has been working since around 2013 with if you poked around on the internet, you could discover some people think are people at the highest levels of the People's Liberation Army's, various units that are involved in bioterror defense, vaccine, production for potentially bioweapons, or offensive, bioffensive, biological warfare, biological material protection. So I think what you want to look at is, you talked about what happened in Wuhan. In this is the first indication that a bunch of soldiers from around the world got sick there, and Q and her husband are walked out of the lab, in August 2019. We don't have any information that anything from Winnipeg, including biological materials, was sent to work on bat coronaviruses. What we do know is that Dr. Chu was secretly enlisted through something called China's, People's Liberation Army Thousand Talents Plan to be the international lead researcher on a bat coronavirus gain of function research project with, as I found from redactions that I pieced together, the Batwoman, Dr. Shi, and another person who Dr. Q introduced into the Winnipeg lab, who, without adding on too many pieces of information here, this third person, very important person, a Wuhan senior technician, is caught trying to walk 10 vials from Dr. Chu's lab room in Winnipeg out of the Winnipeg lab in October 2018. So there's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of timelining going on. But what I want to stress here is that CSIS found at the highest levels, Dr. Chu was working with Dr. Shi, the Batwoman, and others on bat coronavirus technology and Ebola. Very clearly, Canada is sharing Ebola and Nipah, mice and guinea pig adapted. And dangerous research is happening in Wuhan with Dr. Chu's collaborators. This is now proven in the CSIS documents. And something happens in, late summer to fall 2019. And so we're not saying Dr. Chu was in that lab and dropped a vial. We're saying that her collaborators are suspected by my sources in Western intelligence of messing up. Some scientists got sick, and Winnipeg and Canada was very clearly involved in China's efforts in that dangerous research in any number of pathogens, not just Ebola and bat coronavirus.
Okay. And so for our American listeners, when we reference CSIS, we're talking about Canada's intelligence agency, same as the CIA in the United States. Now, I guess the main question I want to ask here is so it is Canada is directly implied or implicated in gain of function research by this, right?
Yes, the CSIS documents, even the parts that are unredacted and we can read, say, Dr. Q in the Winnipeg lab was secretly enlisted, secretly paid through the Wuhan Institute and the People's Liberation Army to work with Dr. Shi. And, Dr. Shi, it said, a high-level, redaction, deputy director from the Wuhan Institute, works with controversial, U.S. studies into gain of function and bat filoviruses in 2015. And, just to tie off, the CSIS report says this was controversial. It wasn't to continue in the United States, but secretly Dr. Chu in Winnipeg and the people that we know, Dr. Shi, the Batwoman, and others are working on it. So it's putting together the pieces of the puzzle that, online researchers, access to information experts have been pointing for years now, a couple years, to this controversial group of scientists in the United States and in Wuhan, and we're adding Dr. Chu at the highest level of the pyramid, up there with the Chinese collaborators.
Wow. Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe when I was reading your story and I was looking through the documents that they were also working on some form of mRNA vaccine as well. Am I right or am I wrong here?
No, you're right. I mean, what I take from the documents is one thing, and then I do my online, open source research. And we risk getting into, so much detail here, but absolutely, they were, in one case, we're talking about two high level Chinese intelligence military projects to work on the bat coronavirus kind of gain of function research. And at the same time, of course, they're looking at vaccines, and they're working on Ebola gain of function, and they're looking at reverse engineering, through mouse and guinea pig adapted viruses, whether they can come up with a vaccine for that. And so this is very interesting. Let's just look at the Ebola. The documents from Canada say, oh, surprise, what was sent to Wuhan in March 2019? Mice and guinea pig adapted, viruses, Ebola, Nipah. So it's looking like something was being worked on for a long time in the Winnipeg lab. Materials are going back and forth, and they're working on whether you want to call it bioweapon research, whether you want to call it gain of function for the purposes of creating vaccines to save humanity. Look, I've learned in my, hard earned, expertise with China, I'm sorry, you have to expect the worst. And my intelligence sources believe that they're working on bad things while they're working on, vaccines at the same time. I'll add this, details I found are that Dr. Chu is working with something called CanSino Biologics, which is the company that eventually, it's a People's Liberation Army high level, scientific unit that works on their vaccines together with these, shadowy collaborators in Chinese intelligence that Q is aligned with, according to these documents. They're the ones, CanSino, that worked with Canada on the coronavirus vaccine eventually. There's no explanation for why. And,
Right.
I found the same scientist that Dr. Chu can be found working on Ebola. She helped, the documents say, she opened a door of convenience for China by giving them the genetic code to some Ebola, strains, and they could work on programs. She's doing papers with all these People's Liberation Army, what the papers call people involved in biooffensive research. And these very same people that Dr. Chu is on research papers with are shown as inventors on the coronavirus vaccine in 2020. So I'm saying what we need to be very clear here is I'm saying the evidence connecting Dr. Chu to work on Ebola is much stronger. Dangerous work. My US State Department lead investigator source said they're collecting intelligence from other nations, and they're making Ebola more contagious. It's the most dangerous stuff you can ever think of, right? And Dr.
Yeah.
Chu is directly involved in that. But the very same circle of people are involved in coronavirus work and vaccine production. You can't separate all these dangerous pathogens.
Yeah. And okay. And I mean, look, just for the listeners, if you haven't connected the dots, if they're doing gain of function research on the Ebola virus and at the same time working on a Ebola vaccine, it is, I mean, in the future, you want to talk about biological warfare. You could unleash a highly transmissible version of the Ebola virus on the world and be the only ones with the vaccine. I mean, essentially, you could take out the entire planet, right?
In 2020, we'd be, tarred and feathered for saying these kind of things. But people in the military, people in the intelligence know this is the reality. The scientists, it's even in these papers, Dr. Chu, and she's interrogated by CSIS. Hey, would you like to, answer us? Did you have any idea that the work you're doing could benefit these people who are in China's highest level bioweapon research units? And her answer is so standard. She says, well, I never really thought about it. Scientists only think about, doing good for humanity. They were probably thinking about saving people. Look, okay, I'm not going to say China is the only military in the world that is working away on some dangerous things. But with China, there's no question. When we look at their intentions for the world, the Chinese Communist Party, it's only rational to think that they could be developing highly contagious strains that potentially, if especially, if they feel threatened, could be released. While they would, of course, want to have the vaccine for whoever they want to protect. That's just the reality.
Yeah, and just a quick history lesson for people listening. Chairman Mao, the guy who created communism in China, his whole goal, like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, were all components of what was called the Superpower Plan. And his ultimate aim was to acquire nuclear missiles with feasible delivery systems, and Khrushchev was the one who gave him the technology, but he never achieved a delivery system. But really what he wanted to do was have a plethora of nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage. Essentially, that was his ultimate plan, was to turn China into the world hegemon through having just insane nuclear power and not being afraid to use it. Xi Jinping is a step back toward Mao, right? China made progress over the years, and Xi Jinping took China back toward where Mao was. So it's not totally outside of the realm of possibility that somebody like Xi Jinping would have a highly transmissible Ebola virus and use it to hold the world hostage. It's not outside the realm of possibility. And so, Sam, I want to pivot here and I want to ask you, how do these scientists end up in a Canadian lab?
Yeah, what I was able to do with these documents is there's a really good, although highly redacted, you can piece together. CSIS says there's these entities, without getting into mumbling through all the names, like Academy of Military Medical Science, Jilin Medical, Chinese Academy of Sciences. There's about 3 or 4 high level entities that have, as the documents say, weapon capacity, among other things that we can't read in redactions, that from 2013, who I identified as a person that appears to be a very high level intelligence military operator from the Jilin facility that's associated with very dangerous bioweapon research programs, comes to Winnipeg, meets with Dr. Chu. This is in the CSIS documents, and it says a high level collaboration. This is very key. High level collaboration between Dr. Chu, China, and officials in Canada starts in 2013. And so this is what leads within a year or two to Dr. Chu working with Major General Chen Wei on Ebola research, on Dr. Chu giving them the genetic sequence to various things that helped China accelerate their programs. And from a distance, if you're in the scientific community, or if you like to, believe that they're always doing the right thing, it just looks like, okay, this is international collaboration. But as CSIS lays it out, no. Q is working with entities that are involved in collecting intelligence for simply for the empowerment of the People's Liberation Army and their goals to reach certain levels by 2025. And so you have all these collaborations between Dr. Chu, certain PLA scientists from the Jilin facility, George Gao, a name that I was stunned to read, a very high level Chinese Center of Disease Control director, was collaborating with Dr. Chu and her husband on all these papers, secretly working on, strains and antidotes in the Winnipeg lab, with people in Health Canada apparently having zero idea. Yeah. Right. And just to paint the picture here, again, clearly, timeline 2013, very high level collaboration start, and yet that we can sort of read in research papers, but under the radar in the Winnipeg lab, people that can be found online in China, in their People's Liberation Army suit, messing around with vials, are brought in through immigration fraud, are brought in through, Chinese scholarships, are brought in through Dr. Chu and her husband, letting them into the in and out of the Winnipeg lab without really any any reason behind it. So security breaches at a high level, low level. There's like they're using Gmail accounts so that the government can't know what they're sending back and forth. Encrypted USBs. There's just a big conspiracy going on of Chinese operators brought in by Dr. Q at the direction of what I'm calling the highest levels of China's military intelligence, with the overall goal, and I'll end my answer here, of producing these very high-end goals for Xi Jinping and the PLA to develop biotechnology and be the world leader by 2025. This is why they're working on bat coronavirus, gain of function, Ebola, and all these things. The weapons, we're saying that's the strong possibility. Let's be very careful. Okay, you can make the argument you're working on something dangerous, just in case it may pop in from nature, but you want a strong vaccine. My sources, and I believe the CSIS documents are underlining this, saying, no, they're involved. They have the capacity for bioweapon research. So this is what was happening in Wuhan and Winnipeg being used.
So in this circumstance, and I guess in all circumstances, I mean, what you just laid out is essentially they were doing this for 6 years, flying completely under the radar, or if not completely, mostly, right? People turning blind eyes to what was happening. And now, as a result, we don't really know what role that lab played in the pandemic that ensued. But I mean, I think it's safe to assume that we had some level of involvement with our lab and collaborating with the Chinese lab. And I have to ask, is Canada targeted by China, in this scenario because of, weak security and just general incompetence and stupidity? Or is this more of a secret partnership, a partnership that is, very clandestine in nature?
That remains to be seen, and I'll answer like this. Before, the United States would never have this happening in their labs. They would have their scientists, go with their controversial scientists involved with the same people. So the US government can't just walk away and say, hey, we've never, funded, weird research. But what's happened in Canada very clearly, as you say, there at this point, no one with any credibility can say Canada was its capacity, our scientific capacity at the highest levels was used to build Wuhan. There's no question. The documents say, even just looking at Dr. Chu, her expertise as the only what they called Chinese, supposedly she's Canadian, they say Chinese researcher in a foreign P4 lab. That's why she was brought in to give the Wuhan the quote unquote safety credentials, the training, so that they could do these collaborations. So that's the China side. Canada built that capacity. There's no doubt. 2013 to what's happened now, this is just one case. This is it's beautiful because the conspiracy is timelined out on this, case that I'm saying clearly, relates to the pandemic indirectly in some way. This happened. Your question is, is it naivety and stupidity or corruption and espionage? That's still to be determined. But I believe, of course, this isn't just Dr. Chu and her husband. Strongly believe there will be Canadian administrators that are implicated in this. Let's look at, the people that approved Canada working with CanSino Biologics of the PLA on a vaccine. That can't happen in a real country, right? Why is this happening in Canada? So for me, there's still more work to be done, but it's completely consistent that you would have just this flood of Chinese intelligence activity in Canada's health system, specifically this lab, because you have influencers and, PLA, Ministry of State Security facilitators that have access to Canadian bureaucrats that can influence, can persuade, can suggest, let's make this happen. And so it's the same. What I'm getting at, it's the same as the election interference story. This stuff is happening in the bureaucratic or scientific area of Canada because it's happening in the political sphere in Canada. It's happening at a high level in Ottawa. It's happening in our police. unfortunately, at some level in other areas as well. And that's the story.
Man, it's just it's so hard to hear this stuff, right? Because it's it alludes to just there being no happy ending to this story, right? No positive outcome, because we're in a lot of trouble here. And so I guess the next question is how do these scientists send these highly biohazardous viruses from Winnipeg to China? Like, how does it get through all the checkpoints?
Yeah, I want to start by saying, I timelined out what CSIS had found, and there's just a very compelling timeline that this what's only known as individual two. Let's think of three people: Dr. Chu in Winnipeg, individual two, this Wuhan Institute animal injection technician, the senior person that helped her get in secretly to these, Wuhan, under the table pay programs, and Dr. Shi, the Batwoman. So individual two on October 12th, 2018, is caught trying to leave the Winnipeg lab with 10 vials. We don't know what's in them. I suspect it's something to do with the Ebola mice and guinea pig that they so dearly wanted and were sent out on March 2019. But there's a whole chain of events in there showing how China deceived Canada, how Q, sent our intellectual property, which is more, importantly, dangerous pathogens that could have killed Canadians on the airplane, flying out of Canada to Wuhan. Uh, but to jump to the chase, I would say, a number of administrators in Health Canada chew, and let's just say, apparently she's very persuasive and, very, I would say, almost pushy. We can read that in her emails. There's a barrage of emails so that what they couldn't steal from Winnipeg in October 2018. Remember, let's look at this timeline. These high-end projects in Wuhan were to start in January 2019 and spring 2019. That's Ebola and bat coronavirus. Clearly, they want something from Canada very urgently in late 2018. Apparently, they don't get it. They get it March 2019 through Dr. Chu pushing emails. She sends one that says the Crown doesn't regulate the Crown. And as I read that, this is like someone that's a scientist trying to quote law to another, bureaucrat that's saying, "Hey, slow down. Do we know what we're sending out?" And so, I mean, I'll end the answer here. The stuff flies out the door in March 2019, and there's all kinds of safety hazards. And there's an email from a bureaucrat in Health Canada that it's probably the only smart email I've read in this thing. It doesn't go all the way, but he says something like, "All this stuff going to Wuhan. How did you link up with these people? If you trust them, I guess it's okay." Right. So at least someone was going halfway to asking a good question, but they didn't stop it. So it's just what I see, just relentless Chinese intelligence operations to get that stuff out of Canada.
Oh my, it's just so appalling, right? Because it's like, how did nobody at any point? I mean, these are people who are tasked with keeping our country safe. I mean, that's I think that's the part that's like sickening to me, is like these are the people who are supposed to be asking the questions and going, "Hey, I don't think we should be sending this stuff over. Like, I don't really care what you're working on. This is a matter of national security."
We've talked about, I mean, I'll make a comparison. Look, we're at the point now in Canada where the stench coming off this government in the bureaucracy with regards to contracting, procurement, fraud, those are one things. Canadians get angry over dollar and cents issues, and they should. I'm saying it's indicative of a systemically corrupt and old school corrupt government, that bureaucrats that should be in charge of making sure, you don't give 70 million for a whatever $50,000 app, or in this more important case, you don't let mice and guinea pig adapted gain of function viruses be stolen by Chinese intelligence,
Right.
and potentially help Canada build China's this hostile regime's capacity to hurt the world. And that happened. And there's been no accountability in Ottawa so far. as I've said, the CanSino coronavirus vaccine story, it's directly tied to this. It's a whole other issue. That's National Council of Research in Canada. Again, another bureaucracy that I would hazard a guess there, because I know there's corruption of Canadian officials. There's bribery. There's jobs that, and honorifics that get given to Canadian, elites after they graduate from government. So there's corruption happening. I'm certain at the end of the day, we will see high level old school corruption in the Winnipeg lab case as to why some of these things can happen from top to bottom.
Yeah. It's just the difference is here is this isn't, the mob embezzling, racket doing or, running a racketeering, scheme, right? Like this is a matter of, global security and health and potential, deaths of millions of people. So I want to zero in on Dr. Q for a second, because you did some digging and looked into her background a little bit. Can you talk about her story a little bit, where she's from, who she's affiliated with on the Chinese side, and what was, I mean, I can't even say hidden, because if you can go on the internet and figure out who this lady is, the people in our ministries obviously could have done the same thing. But can you just talk about what you found in looking into her background?
Yeah, so she's from Tianjin, which is an area of China, which, not surprisingly, is the home base of CanSino Biologics, this People's Liberation Army war unit that I've been talking about. And, her timeline and her husband, they come over in the early 2000s. They're star scientists. They get into Canada's scientific system. Dr. Chu is given a Governor's General Award, for some reason, star scientist. Let me add that it'll be very helpful for her to have that kind of award, to, climb the ranks of these international collaborations. And at the same time, the CSIS investigation shows she's given high-level awards from the Chinese side for international cooperation, for benefiting China on their, getting into the Ebola sort of scientific race. And these kind of awards that are given to her, as I indicate, from Chinese intelligence, are what propel her forward into a high-level operator. So let's just drop back. Something so interesting to me is Dr. Chu and her husband, two clearly high-level scientists, especially with the wife. But it wouldn't be out of the realm of historical, precedent for a couple from China to go to a foreign country, not as their, a professional, what they appear to be. They're actually a couple of spies, right? That there's cases, engineers, etc. So in this case, what's really interesting is they're collaborating at the highest level with, again, Major General Chen Wei. These names won't mean so much to some of the listeners now, but again, these scientists at this Wuhan Institute that's involved in the highest levels bioweapon research, again, George Gao, they're involved at the highest level with the people at the highest level of China's capacity. And at the same time, what I found in the documents is they're operating like a, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, like a husband and wife spy couple. They're covering up the involvement of the Jilin military unit operatives. In some research papers they did, there's a great piece of evidence. Dr. Chu, they go into a Microsoft document, CSIS, and say, she writes, can you take this association off? And of course, that's the Smoke and Gun Association of a PLA bioweapon research unit. So they're doing that kind of stuff. As I said, another one that struck me, I don't know the person's name, but she's pretty important. There's a PLA researcher called Restricted Visitor One who lives in Dr. Chu's second house in Canada. Although she's a student, somehow she has a Chinese public, employee passport, and she's the mentor. She's the mentor of Major General Chen Wei. So again, this Restricted Visitor One is at the highest level in China on this kind of research. And, Dr. Chu and her husband are letting these military researchers, as we know now, in and out of the lab. They're letting them run the shop, essentially. Another quote that stuck out is some of the Canadian scientists that were interviewed said that these Chinese student researchers acted entitled, and they were running into restricted areas just without any clearances, right? So that's what's happening. What I want to stress to finish the answer is Chu is working with the most prominent, highest level Chinese scientists, and she's working inside the lab, hand in hand with her husband, facilitating what I can say with confidence are Chinese military intelligence operators who are in that lab to collect our scientific capacity, and, as I say, to collect biological material and send it to China.
My God. Okay. So next I want to talk about CanSino a little bit, because you touched on them a few times in our conversation here. So just to be clear, is CanSino strictly a vaccine research group, or do they manufacture vaccines for sale as well?
They, as I understand, they have the patent along with the People's Liberation Army on China's coronavirus vaccine, which, if you'll recall, they worked together with Canada and then ditched Canada halfway through the process and didn't, whether we want their vaccine or not. They clearly hoodwinked us, which is another story. But CanSino, very clearly, they are involved in a key part of this story, which is the Thousand Talents Plan. This is the People's Liberation Army program to send Chinese scientists worldwide, or to pressure, persuade, sweeten up people that have moved to other countries, probably not wanting to have, everyday contact with China. They go to these, and they're not all Chinese. They'll just be, people that are Western based and have always been Western based. They'll go to them and say, can you provide research to us and we can pay you this salary, kind of under the table. So CanSino was part of that Thousand Talents Plan, as I, reported back in 2020 in an exclusive investigation. And they were funding secretly and, supporting Dr. Chu to come over to secret conferences in China. The CSIS documents very clearly say they're an arm of the People's Liberation Army, research and production of vaccines. And again, they're working directly with Major General Chen Wei on the coronavirus vaccine. And remember, Dr. Chu had very early on helped Major General Chen Wei working on Ebola type of vaccines. So this type of research is going on in China, and Canada is assisting.
Okay. And so these two scientists, Dr. Chu or Q, however you want to pronounce it, Dr. Keating Chang, these people are on paper as being Canadian citizens. However, according to what we've discussed so far, it sounds like they arrived in Canada in 2013. Were they here prior to 2013?
They're actually here much earlier, in the 2000s. And so they, by all appearances, just come to Canada as a couple of elite researchers and make a new life here. Whether they brought a child with them or had a child here, they have two homes in Canada. And obviously, Dr. Chu has climbed the ranks of Canadian society, getting a Governor General's Award. And, if you look at her research history, I would find it very hard to believe that she and her colleagues suddenly popped onto the radar of Chinese intelligence in 2013. I would hazard a guess that she has been up to her activities for a lot, and her husband, very likely in, tasked assets, or maybe even we don't know if they're, officially, PLA intelligence or something of that nature. But they've been in Canada for a long time. They're Canadian citizens, and they've been up to very no good since 2013. And I would say we need to know a lot more about what was happening earlier. And I want to stress again, it's very clear to me in reading the documents, this isn't just about two scientists in Winnipeg. There's a lot, or some PLA students that got ejected as well. This goes much deeper, and it goes into the bureaucratic level.
Yeah, and the question I have in my mind is these two people, especially Dr. Chu, considering all of the connections that she has to very high level PLA officers and agents, how do these two people achieve Canadian citizenship? Considering all of their connections to the Chinese military, you would think that it would be a significant conflict of interest for these people to be made Canadian citizens in the first place, right?
Yeah, well, I think my impression is that their citizenship would be from a time of innocence in Canada. That would be
Mhm.
like 2000 to 2010, when we weren't paying, attention at all to people involved in research at a high level in China. Today, if you're a student from, certain universities in China and you come to Canada, even if there's no clear tie or even a hint of a tie to the People's Liberation Army, you might get a very rigorous sort of vetting, and you might not get citizenship. There's a lot of questions being asked now. I'd like to say, a lot of them due to the work and reporting that I've done, but back, the 90s, the 2000s, we can see this in the United States too. People are sent in and it's not clear that they have links to the People's Liberation Army or the United Front or the MSS, and they're able to embed very easily. And so, do we know that it's quite likely that Canada had no idea in the early 2000s that these two had links to the PLA, and they may not even have had at that time. But I wouldn't want to let Canada off the hook either, because there's people I have awareness with in the PLA and with links to organized crime that are still in this country, even though they've been outed so thoroughly by myself. So we're in a bad spot, to your question. But I think people will start to look at researchers and the capacity for what we call dual use civilian, which is really going straight to the PLA. Canada, we know from court cases, at least has awareness of that threat now.
And so, with that awareness, right? Because you've read through the CSIS documents, and it seems like our intelligence agency was a, at least able to piece together most of what was happening, right? Their documents are heavily redacted, so it alludes to them knowing more than any of us are aware. But the question, I guess, for me is, okay, so our intelligence knows what's going on. They've pieced it together. Where are our government bureaucrats on this? Because this seems to be like the worst possible thing that could happen, as a result of the pandemic, finding out that, we've had Chinese scientists inside of our highest level security biolab sending viral samples to China. Where are the government bureaucrats on this?
Yeah, I would agree that CSIS, at least by 2021, has a very, very clear idea of the conspiracy I've laid out from 2013 and how that results in this dangerous work in Wuhan, and Canada's role in that. And I would say that CSIS knows probably what the CIA and FBI know. And I would like to say that I think there's more conclusive evidence of what happened in Wuhan, but it's not declassified at this point, and it's politically explosive. Um, but in Canada, I mean, let's just not joke here. The evidence is very clear that the Trudeau government, for 2 to 3 years, has fought any effort to find out any of these, damaging. Of course, they don't want, to be blamed, but as a country, we need to look at what role we have in building China's dangerous biological material capacity and have some accountability that doesn't still happen. But as you know, the Trudeau government doesn't want any accountability because, as I argue, Justin Trudeau himself and people surrounding him in the Prime Minister's office will, I believe, there's strong evidence to suggest that have already been, through fundraising and etc., tied to the People's Liberation Army, tied to the United Front. And so, whether it's, an issue where for political reasons they're going to come out as they do and say, hey, this is conspiracy theory or anti-Asian racism if you're saying anything, very dangerous happened in the Winnipeg lab. But now the facts are out. Something very dangerous happened, and it's obviously much worse than what we know right now. They're still trying to cover up. They're still doing the same claims of racism. They're I would say, just like the probably like the political interference story, where the Liberal Party of Canada and Justin Trudeau have benefited from Chinese intelligence fundraising. They have benefited from Chinese intelligence targeting the Conservatives, who right now are the least favored party by China. The Liberals are benefiting, and they're probably implicated in the lab case in some ways as well. I can see signs of that in circles in Ottawa, in how they're responding to the information that was forced out of Winnipeg through a parliamentary sort of measure and agreement.
And I mean, timeline wise, it is also important to note that a majority of the cover up that went on here went down mere months before an election in our country. Therefore, Justin Trudeau had every reason to try to cover this up for the sake of his own reelection, right?
That's a great point. That's an unexamined point so far. I mean, it ties into everything, like the Chinese police stations, like the election interference allegations, like Trudeau's direct knowledge that Canadian intelligence has been warning him, as I've reported very directly, at least since 2017, that Chinese political interference is very deep and very proven in Canada's politics and bureaucracy, and they've done nothing. So yeah, the Winnipeg lab case would be another major, story, a major case that they would want to suppress, because it would have a big damage on their electability, and it would potentially hurt some of the people that are friendly to them and funding them on the Chinese intelligence side, from my evidence.
And yeah, and I guess this goes to the larger issue, right? Like we have Chinese money and intelligence so deeply embedded now in our political apparatus that it's kind of hard to see where one ends and the other begins. And
yeah, that's a great way to put it, because it just reminds me of what a police source told me. When you look at the United Front, it's hard to see where the Chinese Communist entity of the United Front ends and where organized crime begins, or vice versa.
right,
They're all rolled up together. And
right.
I'm learning more and more about that.
And I look to the United States, and there's a lot of evidence there that the Biden administration is has been at least partially compromised by the CCP, to put it nicely. And the question, I guess, I know we gotta wrap this up soon, but what does something like this do to our relationships with our allies? Because we're clearly not a serious country in the eyes of the world at this point. If somebody can just walk into one of our well, not one of them, our highest level security biolab, and just send Ebola to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So in your view, how does this impact our relationships with our trade partners?
Yeah, no, I was very rewarded to get a quote in this story about the Dr. Chu network from the US State Department's lead investigator into, probable causes of the pandemic, Dr. David Asher, who told me that he assessed that, on the one hand, he, like, the FBI and others, believe a lab accident caused the pandemic. But talking specifically about Dr. Chu and Winnipeg, in a powerful quote, he said, the Wuhan lab is involved in a web of nefarious activities, biological collection of intelligence, and incredibly dangerous. Making Ebola more super contagious is just one of them. And as he told me, his team at the State Department had significant concerns that Canada, not just Dr. Chu, but Canada's capacity and the Winnipeg lab was being used in this very same, essentially dark war-related, weapons research in China. So I can't get over that point, right? Canada has been used in China's potential biological weapons research. It can't be denied, right? This happened. It's there in the CSIS documents. It's there in the names that I've been able to put to, redactions. Anyone can read it. And as I know, when you talk to people in government, they're very diplomatic, military as well. But I have sources in the US government, military and intelligence, law enforcement. And with 100% confidence, I can say that pressure has been put on Ottawa over the last few years that very clearly there is a falling level of trust in Canada, and most specifically, worst of all, in the current government with regards to their national security posture, which is an absolute joke. There's no other way to put it. It's a
Right.
joke. It's compromised, and as we'll find, as I hope we'll be able to say, there are elements of corruption, very serious corruption.
Yeah, and I mean, not to mention the fact that we've allowed the Chinese military to run, war games here, right? And to, our Canadian armed forces have kind of become entangled with the Chinese military to some extent. And, for our listeners, look, I want to frame it this way. The United States has a very important election coming up this year. And by all accounts, should he still be breathing by November, Donald Trump is more than likely going to be the next president of the United States. Robert F. Kennedy, a distant second, but he has the potential as well. Reality is this: you have a Donald Trump presidency in the United States. They take a firm, hard stance on China. That puts Canada in a very compromising position. We are no. So I read this last week, and Sam, maybe you can comment on this, but we are no longer the United States' number one trading partner. They're doing more trade with Mexico now than they are with Canada. And that's a very dangerous place for us because we rely on them heavily economically, but even more so militarily, right? Our armed forces is all but been destroyed by this government. So if, say, for example, you have a situation where you have a Trump presidency, a Trump administration, and you have a Trudeau cabinet here in Canada, and let's say something drastic happens, we may not be able to rely on our number one ally militarily to come in and help us should we enter into a situation with a very serious threat. And so where does that leave us, right? And I guess that's my concern, right?
Well, there's so many. I mean, there's so many balls in the air in the United States, and what I can say with confidence is, without proclaiming on any of those candidates, it's going to be just an absolute ride, that election. And whatever, if Donald Trump wins, Biden, anyone else, we know, at least I can say this, we know that the US military is a great institution. The CIA, the FBI, the DEA. I have some knowledge of people that work for these, and they're not going to let their country crumble. They're going to have they could have their own political problems. And
Right.
to what you say, I mean, very clearly, I would say that the Trudeau government has already, no one in the world probably wants to be very friendly with Donald Trump. What are you going to do? But that the Trudeau government, more than any, will use whatever happens in the United States to their benefit, and for cheap political points, and they'll go to their base, and whatever bad things are happening in the United States, they'll use that to for their own purposes. And that isn't viewed well by whether you're Trump, Biden, or anyone else. Justin Trudeau is scoring cheap points and taking shots at the America, at the States, even if it's at Trump. That's just not, it's not grown up behavior, right? Other countries don't like that stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
it hurts us diplomatically very badly. Yep, please continue.
the thing I'm worried about is, the threat in Taiwan is very real. We don't know where Canada will be on that. We don't even know where, I think that the American state will and Japan will be strong on that if anything, God forbid, happens. But to your point, yeah, it's just game theory times 1,000. What's going to happen after the U.S. election? And doesn't matter who wins. Canada, for me to simplify my answer, it doesn't matter who wins south of the border. Canada has already lost significant standing, I'm told, in the Five Eyes, right? That needs to
Yeah.
be fixed.
Yeah.
And it can be fixed. It can be turned around. It can't be fixed fast. Also, you can't rebuild a military that has been let to, and it's not just this administration, it's a bad trend. These things can be turned around, but as we've talked before, you got to start to make the turn and start to climb that hill. And it's just, others have asked me, I mean, I don't see anything good for this nation under the current administration. It's just, we're kind of like getting wobbly and coming apart.
Yeah, and that's my concern. Like this Winnipeg biolab story has damaged our reputation within our
Yeah,
Five Eyes allies, of course, right?
around the world. What
But
other
we,
country would do?
yeah, right. But even more so, we lied. We lied about that. We lied about the Emergencies Act. We lied about a lot of things to our allies that only serves to damage our reputation because we're no longer a trustworthy country. And I guess the question I wonder is, which way are they taking us, right? Because obviously China has its eyes set on being the world power, the global power, and they have spread their tentacles into virtually everything. I mean, you go to any country that has any form of natural resource, and China is in the mix there somewhere. I was talking to Michael Yon a few days ago. He's been down in the Darien Gap, right, documenting what's happening down there, and China is just all over the place.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you and I find ourselves here at ground zero in Canada, where we have just basically opened our door to the will of the communist Chinese without, really any thought. And I guess in closing, with all of this interference that we have in our country and all of these entanglements, I can't remember if we've covered this before, but this is a question that stays on my mind. Is it just the fact that we are run by just an incredibly corrupt, rotten oligarchy that's just money hungry and will just take every dollar they can get and do anything for it? Or is there like a deeper ideological element to this, in your view?
There's different thinking on that. I always like to believe that at the end of the day, even with ideology, money is what matters. So the most powerful component is the capture of people like bosses of McKinsey, Dominic Barton, or people on Wall Street, Bay Street. So many law firms in Canada, even if there's good lawyers that know how deep we are in and how are we going to get out, but they can't even do anything. Their law firms have such business with China that they're conflicted, even if they wanted to do something, right?
Yeah.
So financial, I would say, is the biggest component. Canada, like a Panama or a Banana Republic, has a pretty small circle, as some of my US financial friends like to say. We can call them tycoons, oligarchs, families, 20 or 30, maybe 80 big families in Canada. A lot of good ones, but a lot of them are just sucked into what's happened. And some of them probably are only realizing the damage they've done to this country and how are we going to get out of it? So there's that. Other people have the theory that, Trudeau Sr. Clearly, ideologically, had a love for China. His son, inherited some things there. There's theories about, what are called missionary kids, like in the 60s or 70s. These would be, clear-eyed, supposedly, great young Canadians that had some affinity for China and came back and infused the country. But I think it's all, at the end of the day, it's about, industrialists, money, who politicians need big business persons behind them to get elected. And that, at the end of the day, that's what's responsible here.
Man, Sam, someday I want to just have you on and we'll just talk about happy stuff. We should start a Jason and Sam Reed inspirational memes cast, and we'll just sit here for just kind of balance this all out. Because I told you on email yesterday, but you terrify the shit out of me, man. You scare me. I love you to death, but every time we talk, I'm like, oh, Sam.
Well, there's a lot of work to be done. So
yeah,
one day when some of these laws that I've been talking about, the need for them, are put in place, then yeah, we can have a happy talk about okay, we've got a law in place. What do we do now? There's a big hill to climb.
Right. Well, until then, Sam, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, man. As always, hang around once we're done recording here. But for now, tell everybody where they can find you.
You can find me on Twitter at Scooper Cooper. And more importantly, to pay the bills, I'm running the platform thebureau.news, where you can find all of my investigative reporting on a weekly basis.
Yeah. And listen, guys, the Bureau is fast. Well, it's not fast becoming. It has become my main source of information. I used to go and read the National Post with my coffee every morning. Now I go to the Bureau first. Sam gives me what's really going on in the world, and then I go over to the National Post. I cannot recommend the Bureau enough. Look, Sam, I say this behind your back, and I'll say this to your face. He's a Pulitzer Prize level journalist. This is a real journalist. This is not a guy who just says things for the sake of clicks or to get your dollars. Sam is nonpartisan, and just top level journalism. Sam, I'm so glad you're out there, man. As much as you scare me, I'm so glad you're out there because there's so few of you left. And guys, please go and subscribe to the Bureau. Read it. There's no fluff in any of Sam's reporting. It's all just straight facts. It's exactly what you hear here, just in words with documents, and even more scarier shit that we didn't even cover because I don't even know how far down the rabbit hole we can go in an hour. But
And I want to tell people, this is serious stories, but a lot of these are cinematic, and people go to the Bureau and read about how these people tried to leave a lab on October 12th, 2018, and I think you're going to see a movie scene in your mind.
Yeah, it's frightening, and it's like a scene from Outbreak. But for those of you who do want to read the full report, it's in the link below in the description. It's linked below. But just go to the Bureau, sign up, and just make the Bureau one of your cornerstones for information. I can't stress that enough. I use the Bureau all the time, and Sam keeps me informed on a bunch of shit I wish I didn't know about. So, Sam, as always, my brother, thank you so much, man. It's always an honor to talk to you.
Thanks. Talk soon.